Recording now. And let's talk about pick up where we left off. We had last left Charles Darwin, or as I call him, Chuck D, hanging around in South America, collecting fossils and collecting specimens, animals and birds and rock samples and things like that, shipping them back to the United Kingdom, getting very interested in everything that he saw. Remember that since he was outside the ship's chain of command, he's not, someone under the captain's control. And his dad was pretty rich and had, given him access to a line of credit, I think. So he had plenty of money to hire guides and ramble all around southern South America, all through Brazil and Argentina. There's a little backstory, and it's actually going to come back. I promise you, I could come up with a lot more things to say, but the things I'm emphasizing now are actually going to play a role down the line. This is not just trivia that I want you to know. They finally reached the southern tip of South America, and there is a large island off the South American southern tip. There's a very narrow strait between the two. The island's called Tierra del Fuego, land of fire. And the Beagle encountered the Fuegians. That's a watercolor by the ship's artist, because they brought one, showing the Beagle sailing into the strait, and you can see a canoe with some Fuegians in it. They themselves call themselves either Yamana or Yagan. I'm not sure why there's two names. You'll see both. And these are the southernmost of all Native Americans, distant kin to the natives of North America. They'd spread southward probably 11,000 years ago, actually probably more than that, we now think, and had been living there. They're boat builders, primarily feed on seafood, and living a hunter-gatherer existence as they do, they don't own a great deal of property. Remember, this was the Beagle's second voyage. The first one left in 1826, and the captain of that one had committed suicide, and Fitzroy had been brought on to finish the job. And the second voyage was when he wanted to come back and do it really right. On that first voyage, some of the Fuegians had snuck aboard the Beagle and stolen one of the ship's little boats. So Fitzroy kidnapped one of the Fuegians as a hostage to ensure that they gave the boat back. And for whatever reason, the Fuegians did not get the idea, and now Fitzroy's got this Fuegian on the boat. And he gets the idea that he can take some Fuegians back. This is a people that's still very little known, even, in Britain. He wants to take some back with him. And he was thinking he could teach them to speak English and wear proper clothes and, become Christians according to the doctrines of the Anglican Church. And then he could bring them back to Tierra del Fuego, and they would civilize their entire tribe. They would teach them, how to wear proper clothing and eat from plates with knives and forks and worship in the Anglican Church according to the Book of Common Prayer. And so they were actually passengers on the second Beagle voyage. They were going home after having spent about 3 years in Britain. He'd taken 4. The first one had died of smallpox almost as soon as they reached Britain. Fitzroy, or the sailors, had given him the name Boat Memory because he was the one that had been taken hostage when the Fuegians took the boat. And we don't know very much about poor Boat Memory. The other 3 were going back. There was a girl of about 10 whose name was Fuegia Basket, or at least that's what the sailors called her. They gave them names. I forget what her name was in her own language. There was a tall man in his middle 30s. He was very tall, and the sailors nicknamed him after a tall British church, and they called him York Minster. And then this is Jemmy Button, whose name in his own language was Orundelico. He was called Jimmy Button because supposedly his mother had traded him for a pearl button. So he's a teenage guy. You can see that he cleaned up pretty well. On the right, that's him wearing, English style clothing of the time. And Darwin got to know these people. They spoke enough English that they could communicate. Fuegia was the best at it. They could communicate, and they got to be friends. Darwin would later remember that Jimmy Button was a universal favorite. The expression of his face showed his nice disposition. He was merry and often laughed, and was remarkably sympathetic with anyone in pain. Now, the Fuegians used to go out in some of the roughest oceans in the world, in the sub-Antarctic, to capture shellfish and go fishing. And, the Fuegians do this, from the time they're toddlers, or they used to back in those days. And as such, they just don't get seasick. They're accustomed to rough oceans, rough seas from very early on. And Darwin got very seasick. And so periodically on the voyage, Jimmy would notice that Darwin was hanging over the side, having just lost his lunch. And Jimmy would walk up and pat him on the head and say, "Poor, poor fellow." And then he would start laughing because he couldn't figure out why Darwin was sick, because he didn't know what seasickness was. And the reason I'm bringing up all of this, there's Fuegia basket up there at the top in the dress, top left. There's Jimmy Button in the middle right, and at the bottom, that's York Minster. That's the three. And the reason this is important is Darwin always remembered the Fuegians. As he said, they rank among the lowest barbarians, but I was continually struck with surprise how closely the three natives on board HMS Beagle, who had lived some years in England and could talk a little English, resembled us in disposition and in most of our mental faculties. Darwin got to do something that's almost impossible to do now, and that is communicate with people who had grown up, at any rate, completely isolated from Western culture. These days you find a, tribe living in the backwoods of the Brazilian rainforest or something, and half of them are wearing New York Yankees caps or something like that. But these were people whose mentality was still shaped by an environment that was fundamentally different from his own. And yet they had minds that he could easily recognize. They told jokes, they had feelings. They may have actually trolled him. Supposedly, one of them told Darwin that in winter, when there wasn't enough food, they killed their elderly. And Darwin said, "Well, wait, why don't you do that with your dogs?" And the guy laughed and said, "Dogs help us catch otters. Old people don't." And that ended up in Darwin's book and in textbooks and things like that. But no one else has ever been able to find evidence that the Fuegians ever did that, which makes me think that what they were doing was trolling their friend. And that's something you can definitely comprehend. That kind of motivation shouldn't be strange. They've got minds like his and minds like yours. So it's a rather uncomfortable thought that these so-called savages might actually be fundamentally like us, not really different in intelligence, and certainly not different in character from people you might meet on the street every day. That's interesting. That's going to end up important. Anyway, they sailed up the Pacific coast of Chile after having dropped off the Fuegians. They also dropped off a missionary who was going to live amongst them. And as soon as the Fuegians got home, they immediately shucked their English style clothes York Minster ran off with Fuegia Basket, which is kind of icky because she was about 10 and he was in his 30s. Jimmy Button, they later saw him again, the Beagle did, and he was dressed back in his old clothes, back in his old life, and told them that he had absolutely no desire to, go back to British ways. And the Fuegians stole all of the missionaries' goods and then threatened to kill him. So they picked him up and put him on a ship going back to England. So that attempt to civilize the Fuegians did not work. The Beagle went on up the Pacific coast of Chile and reached the town of Concepcion, which looked like this because it had just been hit with a massive earthquake. An earthquake of the sort that still sometimes hits the coast of Chile. Remember, the Pacific coast is sometimes called the Ring of Fire because there's a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes along the rim of the Pacific Ocean, both in the Americas and in Asia and in New Zealand as well. And this is, there have been earthquakes this size not too long ago. I think there was one about 10 years ago. So the town is trashed. Darwin went walking around on the beaches outside of town, and he found beds of clams that attach themselves to rocks, oysters and mussels. And these things grow only on rocks that are submerged for most of the time. But these oyster and mussel beds had been lifted out of the sea by as much as 10 feet. These being oysters, they can't move on their own. The only way that could happen would be if the land had been lifted out of the sea. Depending on where you measure it, it got lifted as much as 10 feet. This is actually pretty common during large quakes. I've been to a spot called Fairview Peak in Nevada, where a sizable mountain was thrust upwards by as much as 10 feet during a quake that actually happened in, I want to say, 1955. I've been to another spot near Independence, California, where a mountain range was shoved upwards by, again, roughly where I was, I'd say 6 to 8 feet during a quake in 1872. There were people who have observed this happening. And so Darwin thinks, okay, so this quake is a big catastrophe, but it's not one of these ginormous global things that completely resurfaces the Earth. Quakes like this do happen. One that big, maybe once a century or something like that. They're terrifying if you're in them, but they're the kind of thing that people are familiar with. And then Darwin started looking for fossils along the coast, and he started finding beds of seashells. This is a modern photo, of course. That's not Darwin in the picture, but that's a ways back from the beach, a couple of 100 feet above sea level. And that flat kind of grainy area that's in the foreground, that's all seashells compacted together, much like the on a typical beach today, you might find pretty sizable deposits of old broken seashells. I know I've seen that before. And this should give you an idea of the kind of thing that Darwin saw. Well, how did the seashells get there? Well, he kept on going, and he crossed the Andes Mountains from the Pacific side. And at Agua de la Zorra in Chile, he found a petrified forest, a deposit of not just petrified wood, but a place where entire tree trunks had been buried, turned into stone by mineral-rich groundwater, and then exposed. You might be able to see that's actually a little plaque that was put up at this petrified forest commemorating the visit of Darwin. The plaque says what? Bicentenario de su nacimiento, 12 de febrero de 1809, and 150th anniversary of his publication of The Origin of Species. So that was put up for Darwin's 200th birthday. That's what one of these looks like. That's a tree trunk eroding out of this mountainside. And when he got samples back to Britain, the structure of the wood turned out to be resemble a South American conifer in the genus Araucaria. We don't have native Araucarias in North America. They're unique to South America and Australia and New Zealand. If you are into potted plants and gardening, you might know the Norfolk Island pine. It's sold here as an ornamental. I've seen them sold at Kroger as a potted Christmas tree type plant around Christmas. That's a relative of Araucaria. There's a South American Araucaria called the monkey puzzle tree, very spiky and would be very puzzling to climb. But here's that link between fossils and living species again. Why would you find fossil Araucaria-like wood in a place that has living Araucarias in it? You know, it's the same question as why you would find fossil armadillos in a place that has modern armadillos living in it. And then how did you get trees growing in what's now not only desert, it's 7,000 feet above sea level? That's almost 1.5 miles. Darwin concluded, one of his first books, by the way, when he got home, was a book on the geology of South America. He'd made enough detailed observations that he wrote a very respected book on South American geology. That's one of the maps from the book. You can see Concepcion is about 1/3 of the way down on the left-hand side. That's Chile and the Andes. And Darwin concluded that the coast of Chile was rising, and that this rising had been, as he put it, caused by successive small uprising, such as that which accompanied or caused the earthquake of this year, and likewise by an insensibly slow rise, which is certainly in progress on some parts of this coast. That's very Lyell. That's got Lyell's fingerprints all over it. Remember, Lyell was the one that said you don't need to come up with these global, colossal, earth remaking cataclysms to explain why the earth is the way it is. You need processes you can see going on today multiplied by lots and lots of time. That's Lyell's uniformitarian approach. As I've said, we do know that there actually have been some pretty major catastrophes in Earth history. The meteorite that hit the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs and some other critters is probably the best known example. There's also whatever happened 245 million years ago that wiped out something like 99% of all species of animal on the planet. But even though we now recognize that there can be catastrophes like that, it's still very fruitful to interpret a lot of the rock and fossil record that we have in these uniformitarian terms. All you need are processes you can observe today, like earthquakes. I think I mentioned that really big ones hit that part of the world roughly every 100 years or so. They don't hit on a schedule, but they're not the kind of thing that no one has ever seen before. Big earthquakes happen in Chile, and of course, smaller earthquakes are more frequent. Each big earthquake might only raise the coast a few feet, but multiply, let's say one earthquake every 100 years raises the coast 10 feet. Well, okay, doing the math in my head, that means that in 10,000 years, roughly, very roughly, in 10,000 years, your coastline is going to be 1,000 feet in the air. I think I got that right. Yeah, it'll take you 10,000 years to raise your coastline 1,000 feet because the average rate of rise is going to be, a tenth of a foot each year. So in the course of 70,000 years, what had been a forest growing near the coast could now be 7,000 feet in the air. The actual numbers are probably different. That's not really critical. But the point is that you can explain why you get petrified forests in mountain deserts and why you get beds of fossil seashells 1,300 feet higher than the actual ocean is now. You can explain that by means of processes that you can observe, or at least processes you have records of, multiplied by large lengths of time. Very Lyellian of Darwin right here. And when Darwin got back to England, Lyell was very keen to meet him. They ended up becoming friends and colleagues. Certainly Lyell felt that Darwin's observations strengthened his position a great deal and supported him. Okay, it's been 4 years. 4 years of everybody on that ship smelling each other's feet every night. The mission's officially accomplished. Everybody really wants to go home, but Fitzroy takes the long way and sails up the South American coast to Peru, crosses the Pacific all the way to Australia, sails around Australia and cuts across the Indian Ocean to South Africa, sails around South Africa, goes up the South Atlantic, stops one more time in Brazil just to check a few measurements, and then back up the North Atlantic they go and on up to England. But they stopped for water and some exploring for 5 weeks in September and October of 1835 at a couple of little lumps of volcanic rock sticking up out of the ocean directly astride the equator, islands named for the Spanish word for giant land tortoises. These are the Islas Galápagos. You might possibly have heard of the Galapagos Islands. This was the trip that made them famous. They are now a protected national park owned by the country of Ecuador. One of these days before I die, I'd love to set foot on them. They are popular with eco-tourists and things like that. There's a research station on one of them. And I actually know someone who married a man who used to run the only pizza parlor in the Galapagos Islands. The islands have a town that's I want to say 20,000 people. It's fairly large considering it's on a desert island. So there's your map. They're right on the equator. The equator actually cuts across the northern tip of the largest of those islands, that kind of bent looking one called Isabella, over to your left. There's a few of the islands that are a little north of the equator, Pinta and Marchena and Genovesa and Darwin and Wolf, set aside a little bit. They're on the equator, but these are not really tropical islands lush with palm trees and with abundant fruity rum drinks with paper umbrellas in them. They're kept relatively cold because the Humboldt Current moves from south to north up the South American coast and brings cold water to them. So they're kept fairly cool. They're also subject to extreme droughts, especially in El Nino years. You might know El Nino is this funny thing that the weather does every few years when circulation patterns in the Pacific weaken and even reverse to an extent. And that causes changes in global weather that ripple, all over, certainly all over the Western Hemisphere. What El Nino years do to the Galapagos is subject them to very severe drought. These are not very lush islands. They are, well, desert islands. Darwin actually did some hiking across the lava deserts where he was probably risking his life. It's kind of dangerous to hike there in hot weather on these islands that don't have much water. They're volcanic. Every so often, eruptions still happen. The last I checked was an eruption on the island of Fernandina, which hit in April 2009, although I think they've had some smaller little rumblings since then. Isabella is that large island in the center, and then Fernandina is immediately to the left of it. And that's a picture taken from, I think, the International Space Station. And you can see the plume of volcanic ash coming out of Fernandina. That stuff that looks like smoke. So they're volcanic, they're small. You don't have to be too much of a Lyellian to conclude that the islands haven't been around all that long. If they were, they probably would have built up more. They're still erupting. There's evidence of fresh lava flows. That's a congealed lava flow on the Galapagos Islands. Looks kind of like, somebody poured fudge into a cold pan. And the Galapagos Islands are, relatively speaking, quite young. They're much younger than the South American mainland, which Darwin had been studying, for the past 4 years or so. The Galapagos haven't been around all that long. There's a lot of very distinctive wildlife on the Galapagos that people still come to see and that scientists still study, including Sula nebuxii right there. That's the blue-footed booby. I should mention, by the way, that booby at the time was slang for an idiot. And the sailors used to call it that because it had no fear of humanity, and you could just walk right up to the boobies and kill them. The boobies being not afraid of humanity made them stupid. A smart animal runs like hell when he sees a human coming. Anyway, that's why it's called that. That's a male doing, I think that's a courtship behavior. They will, mating pair will do this dance and show off each other's feet, or show off their feet to each other. Anyway, Sula nebuxii flies quite well, and it's not unique to the Galapagos. You can find it all along the coasts of mainland South America and Central America. So that one is not unique to the Galapagos. But the seagulls are. Leucophaeus fuliginosus is the Galapagos gull. It looks like gulls you would find elsewhere. It looks like gulls you'd find all over the New World, the gulls that had probably been following the ship for years, but it's different enough that we designate it as a separate species. Whoops. The Galapagos hawk right there, same genus as familiar North and South American birds. If you know your local birds, you might know Buteo jamaicensis is the red-tailed hawk, which you can see around Conway. The red-shouldered hawk, I forget the species name, but that's another Buteo that's around here. So this is in the same genus as familiar birds, but the species itself is unique to the Galapagos Islands. It's not found anywhere else. The Galapagos penguin is actually the northernmost species of penguin. In fact, remember the Galapagos Islands straddle the equator, so this is the only penguin that you could find naturally in the northern hemisphere. I think they are mostly on the southern islands, but you could actually find this one in the northern hemisphere. This is the northernmost of all penguins. And it's not grossly different from other South American penguins. There's several species in South America along that coast, but nonetheless, it's distinct enough that we place it in its own species, its own endangered species, I might add. Iguanas, native to South America. There's a bunch of species of those. I had a student many years ago that kept one as a pet. He actually brought it to school, brought it to my class, and what I mostly remember about it was that it got scared and crapped all over the tables. Anyway, it looked fairly similar to this, but this is the Galapagos marine iguana, Amblyrhynchus cristatus, and it's unique to the Galapagos Islands. And what it does is hang out on rocks by the sea and soak up the sun. It'll bask until its body temperature is warm enough, and then it will go jump into the cold ocean and swim around and fill itself with seaweed. That's what they eat. And then it'll crawl back out and sun itself and repeat the process. Darwin was once exploring, and he came across a whole colony of these iguanas, and they're territorial. They don't move off their territory. So he walked up to one and he picked it up and he tossed it into the ocean, and it came right back and it settled in the same territory. So he picked it up again and threw it into the ocean, and it came back, and he ended up spending a sizable chunk of the day throwing this iguana into the sea, and the iguana always came right back. I think he got tired of it a long time before the iguana did. That's how they defend their territories. And this is unique. This is not like any South American iguana that I know. Seaweed-eating lizards are not particularly common. You know, prickly pear cactus. We actually get a species of it in Arkansas. It's an Ozark native, but they don't usually form trees except in the Galapagos Islands, where there are 6 unique species of prickly pear cactus. That's one. You can see that one forms. I don't really have a good sense of scale. I don't think they're hugely tall, but you can see it's a cactus that has a woody trunk and bark on it. Very unusual and unique to the Galapagos. And the pattern kept repeating itself. Tomatoes are native to South America. There's a species of tomato, genus Lycopersicon, that is unique to the Galapagos. There are 3 or possibly 4 species of mockingbird that are unique to the Galapagos. Now, Darwin had seen this before. The beagle had stopped briefly in the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina, and Darwin had seen the Falkland Island fox, which is unique to the Falklands. It's demonstrably similar to mainland foxes, but different enough that we call it a different species. So he'd seen this kind of thing before, but in the Galapagos, it's right in your face. The islands were named after Galapagos tortoises, Geochelone elephantopus. They're in the same genus as tortoises that I've seen. I don't know if you know these. They used to be popular as pets, but they've been protected for many years. The Mojave Desert tortoise is also in the genus Geochelone, and these are similar, but they're not the same. In particular, they're quite a bit larger. They're big enough that Darwin actually sat on the back of one of them, found out that he couldn't really get anywhere. He sat on this tortoise, and the tortoise just kind of looked over his shoulder at him and went, or whatever noise they make. and didn't move. So he didn't get to ride a tortoise very far. But that's how large they are. They're as big as like small riding mowers. Darwin was having dinner one night with the governor of the Galapagos Islands. There were at the time maybe 100 people living in a settlement on the islands, mostly just kind of, castaways and runaway sailors. It was apparently kind of a hive of scum and villainy. But they were having dinner and they were eating tortoise because these tortoises are edible. In fact, the Beagle actually collected hundreds of them, brought them on board the ship, stored them with their feet up in the air and the shell down. These tortoises are too big to turn themselves over, and they'll survive that way for weeks because they can tolerate drought and heat. They can tolerate nasty conditions, and then they'd butcher them as they needed fresh meat. So they ate Galapagos tortoise all the way across the Pacific. This, by the way, is why they're all critically endangered now. They're divided into something like 14 different subspecies, at least one of which has, I believe, already gone extinct. The last member of his subspecies was named Lonesome George, and he died several years ago. Anyway, I digress. The governor of the Galapagos just happened to mention that, I can tell where every tortoise comes from just by looking at its shell. And that might have just been utter trivia, but that was interesting to Darwin, who discovered that every island, and in the case of this largest island, Isabella's made up of 5 mountain peaks, and every mountain peak has tortoises with consistently different shell shapes. You can see, the one up at the top, subspecies Beckai, the shell extends in a saddle that protects the neck. That's that thing sticking off to the right. The others don't have that. You can see they're different a bit in proportions, some a little more elongated, some a bit more round. They're different in shell ornament. Vandenbergi has a lot of narrow grooves on it. The others, not so much. And yeah, with a little experience, you could tell where any tortoise on Isabella came from. So that's a little weird. I should mention those volcanoes up there. Inside the craters, there's pools of water. I believe the water condenses because those mountaintops, they don't get a lot of rain, but they do get morning fog, and the fog will condense and drip down. And so you get you get ponds in those craters. The land in between those craters is a lot more dry and much more difficult for tortoises to get across. So tortoises from one peak rarely, if ever, make the trip to another peak. And each one is different enough that we call these subspecies. Wonder why. Darwin shot a whole bunch of birds in the Galapagos, and he stuffed them thanks to the taxidermy lessons he'd had from John Edmonstone. And he didn't realize what he had on his hands until he finally got all of his little stuffed birds back to Britain and showed them to the top bird specialist at the time, a man by the name of John Gould. And it was Gould who said, hey, there's something really interesting about some of these birds that you've just brought me. In particular, he was interested in the finches. Finches are birds in the family Fringillidae. They're seed-eating birds. The finch that you would probably recognize around here is the cardinal. That's a finch. If you've taken ornithology with Dr. McDonald, you might know other finches that are out there. What do we get? Purple finches, I think. And there's finches in South America. And there's finches on the Galapagos, and this is one of them. This is the small ground finch, Geospiza fuliginosa. What's odd about them is there are, I believe, 14 species of finch in the Galapagos, or 13 in the Galapagos and one on an island a bit to the north called Cocos Island, which is not actually part of the Galapagos chain itself. But the finch is usually considered one of the group of 14. You do get different species on different islands, although it's not like the tortoises because there is a lot of overlap. Many species do live on more than one island, but every species shows a very distinct way of life. The small ground finch, small beak, good at handling, picking up, and cracking small seeds. Cactus finch, Geospiza scandens, hops around on cactus and feeds on seeds and fruits and flowers of those prickly pear cacti. Much longer beak and narrower beak, more like a pair of tweezers, which you would want if you're going to be eating off a cactus plant. On the right, the large ground finch feeds on much larger seeds. It's not nearly as good at handling small seeds, but it can apply a lot more force to crack big ones. And as you can see, it's got a very big beak, you know, like a large set of pliers. In fact, the beaks of the finches are often compared to different tools. Like the cactus finch has needle nose pliers. The large ground finch would have like linesman's pliers, which are not nearly as delicate, but can apply a lot more force, and so on. So they're all clearly finches. Most of their bodies share a common structure, and yet they're adapted to different lifestyles, and that's reflected most obviously in their beaks. There's that small beaked ground finch on the left and the large beaked ground finch on the right. And you can see how different those beaks look, and that's connected with different lifestyles, different ecological niches, as we would now say. The Galapagos finches are clearly similar to South American finches called grassquits in the genus Tiaris. But if that's the case, why are they unique to the Galapagos? And why do they fill niches that other birds would fill elsewhere? Why are there finches with giant beaks that look like parrots and no parrots? Why do you have finches like this woodpecker finch, Cactospiza pallida, on the left, that probes around in tree bark for insects, and in fact uses little twigs as tools to do it? Why do you have Cactospiza, a finch, prying around in rotten tree bark for bugs, but you don't have any woodpeckers or flickers or anything like that? Why woodpecker finches but no woodpeckers? Why do you have a finch that feeds on blood? Geospiza difficilis hops around rookeries where seabirds are breeding, like boobies or gulls or albatross or things like that, hops up behind these birds, pecks them right in the butt, drinks up their blood. We actually had a dean here who was a lot like that. Was very good at hopping up behind people, stabbing them in the back and drinking their blood. He got another job elsewhere, fortunately. Darwin would later write, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. It was almost as if there'd been, maybe one species of finch in the Galapagos at one time, and then somehow that species had turned into all of the others. all of which shared the common structure of finches. They all looked like finches in all respects, and yet each one adapted itself somehow to different islands and different lifestyles and different diets. Huh. Interesting idea. Maybe that might explain a lot of the things he'd been seeing. Maybe not just the finches, but the Galapagos mockingbirds and the Galapagos tortoises and the Galapagos prickly pears and the Galapagos penguins and the Falkland Island foxes and more things like that. Huh. You got to think about that one for a while. Okay. That's the end of the slides I've got, but I've still got almost 20 minutes. Clearly, I need to load up more slides next time, but I want to go ahead and keep flapping my gums. What I'm going to do is temporarily, okay, there we go. Took me a minute to change slides. The Beagle left the Galapagos. They crossed the Pacific. They had some interesting encounters in Tahiti. They ended up in Australia. One of the things Darwin noticed was this very odd way in which mammals native to Australia mimicked mammals from elsewhere in the world. These are two Australian mammals, and the one on the left looks like a flying squirrel, which we have in this country. Used to see one now and again in the house where we used to live, or in the neighborhood anyway. The one on the right somewhat resembles the cat that's annoying me. But the one on the left is a sugar glider. It's native to Australia. It's a marsupial. So is the marsupial known as the quoll, aka native cat, as they're called. The sugar glider, of course, glides from tree to tree using those webs of skin between its wrists and ankles. The quoll is a nocturnal carnivore, so ecologically a similar role to a cat, or possibly to a weasel or something like that. You know, they look like familiar mammals, but they're not even closely related. They are marsupial mammals instead of pouched mammals. Australia's got marsupials that dig through the soil. They look a lot like European moles. They've got huge, powerful claws for digging, and they're blind or nearly so, but they're marsupials. Australia's got sugar gliders that look like flying squirrels but aren't. Australia's got these nearly toothless numbats with big claws and sticky tongues for feeding on anthills and termite mounds. And they look like anteaters, but they're not. Australia's got little marsupial bilbies that look like rabbits. Australia's got marsupial mice, which look like mice, but they aren't. Australia used to have the Tasmanian wolf. The last ones went extinct in the 1930s. They looked a lot like wolves or maybe coyotes, but they're not. You know, Australia's got all of these weird mammals, and a lot of them look like, almost like knockoffs of mammals you'd find elsewhere in the world, and yet they're all marsupials. There's no native placental mammals in Australia, with the exception of bats and marine mammals, and I think a couple of unique little mice that made it there a few million years ago, and also the ones that humans have introduced. And Darwin was reminiscing, earlier in the evening, I had been lying on a sunny bank and was reflecting on the strange character of the animals of this country as compared to the rest of the world. A disbeliever in everything beyond his own reason might exclaim, surely two distinct creators must have been at work. Their object, however, has been the same. So it's almost like there were two different creators making the life on Earth, and one of them was cheating off the other. Why is that? Why would you have marsupial moles and not just moles? Or sugar gliders, but not flying squirrels? Why have marsupials that look like anteaters, but not have any anteaters? We'll puzzle over that. They crossed the Indian Ocean and visited a group of islands called the Cocos Islands, and this is one of them. The Cocos Islands, as well as a lot of islands in the Pacific, in the tropics, many of them are what we call atolls, and they're shaped like rings. The oceans surrounding these islands might go down 10, 20,000 feet, very, very deep. The islands often look like a ring of land, and in the center of the islands, there's a lagoon. The lagoon may be closed off, or it may have an opening, a passage to the outer sea. The islands are usually pretty low in elevation, and they're made of mostly of coral rubble. You only find these in the tropics where corals are growing. And Darwin came up with a very Lyellian theory for how these atolls formed. Volcanoes erupt out of the sea. So you start with a volcano, you know, like a mountain peak sticking up out of the ocean. Corals begin to grow on the sides of the volcano along the beach. And once the volcano is extinct, it very slowly sinks down. As it sinks down, coral reefs grow up. And so you'd go from having a volcano with a small ring of coral right along the beach to a progressively smaller and smaller peak inside a ring-shaped lagoon. And then ultimately there's no trace of the volcano still visible. And all you have is this ring-shaped coral growth. And as long as the corals can keep growing upwards, they can counterbalance any tendency for the land to sink down. And so you end up with this. He would later publish these ideas in his first book in 1842. His explanation was correct. It wasn't confirmed until the 1950s. The US was testing nuclear weapons at the time, and they exploded a big bomb on an atoll in the Pacific. This atoll was extremely small, but it got famous because it was a nuclear testing site. And there was a French swimwear designer who decided that since the island covered very little territory, he would name his new swimsuit, which also covered very little territory. So that's how the bikini got its name. The bikini was named for Bikini Atoll, whose other main claim to fame is that it got nuked during the Cold War. I bring this up because Bikini Island was studied very intensely because the US government really wanted to know everything that happens when you drop a nuclear bomb on some place. So, you know, they set up nearby ships to see how they would be affected by getting a blast of radiation. They set up, you know, model houses and things like that. They observed the blast in many ways, and they drilled into the rock making up Bikini Atoll. And I think they had to drill down about 3,000 feet. But after passing through about 3,000 feet of old coral, they finally hit volcanic rock. That would be like going to point C prime on this map, drilling straight down. You'll go through an awful lot of coral, but eventually you will hit the rock that belongs to the ancient volcano. And this basically confirmed Darwin's model of atoll growth. So his explanation turned out to be very much the right answer and very Lyellian. You know, again, we don't have to look for catastrophes using some kind of process that no human has ever seen before. We can use gradual processes, the slow erosion and sinking of volcanoes, the slow upward growth of corals, Coral reefs depend on sunlight, and like plants, they'll grow upwards. Saw my internet connection was unstable there, so I'll repeat. You don't need to explain atolls through some sort of crazy catastrophe. You need slow, observable processes like the sinking of the Earth's crust or the slow upward growth of coral reefs multiplied by lots and lots of time. And that's all you need to understand what's going on here. So anyway, the Beagle rounded Africa, sailed up the Atlantic, stopped off one more time in Brazil to check their chronometers, and returned to England on October 2nd, 1836. Darwin stayed with his family for a little while, moved to London for a while, ended up moving moving to a country house in what used to be a small village outside of London. Today, it's been completely swallowed up by London itself. It's all, I mean, London is huge and it's part of London now. It's the village of Down, and Darwin bought Down House, and he and his family lived there from 1842 until his wife died in 1896. The house is now preserved as a museum, much as it looked when Darwin lived there. Somewhere on that voyage, Darwin had decided he was not actually going to become a priest. Remember that his dad had made a lot of money, and his dad was quite generous. He was mostly a pretty indulgent father. That bit about you care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching was kind of uncharacteristic. And Darwin knew his father would leave him a very sizable sum of money. Darwin ended up investing that, and he never worked a formal job as such, because there were very few jobs as a scientist. Most scientists at the time were, like people like Lyell, who was a lawyer, or Darwin's mentor in Edinburgh. They were professionals, doctors and lawyers and ministers who had enough time and money to indulge a taste for science. There weren't a whole lot of paying jobs for what we would call a scientist now. And when Darwin filled out his government census forms, what he wrote down as occupation was businessman. He was an independently wealthy investor, paid a lot of attention to buying stocks and things like that, and built up the family fortune that way. So he spent the rest of his life financially very, very comfortable. And it's a good thing, because he also began suffering from attacks of a mysterious disease. We don't know what it was, but he'd get these periodic bouts of just terrible weakness. He'd be unable to get out of bed or off the sofa. Some of it sounds almost like panic attacks. He'd have these fits of crying sometimes. He'd wake up in a sweat at night. His digestion was disrupted. Darwin made a lot of notes about how his digestion was going. So we know more about Darwin's farts than we do about a lot of people at the time. Anybody wants to research that, you can go ahead. So for much of his adult life, he simply could not have held down a paying job even if he'd wanted to. He just wasn't well enough. He also had his hands full when they got back, writing up what he discovered, collaborating with experts, showing people his specimens. The scientific community at the time really wanted to meet him, and he was very active in London for a while until that disease finally started showing up. And he got married in 1839. Fortunately, his wife was a very, very good nurse, and she took very good care of him during this attacks of this chronic illness that he had. There's still debate. He might have picked up a long-lasting parasite in South America, possibly trypanosoma, this protist parasite. There was a psychiatrist a few years ago who wrote a book claiming that it was all psychological tension. The latest that I've seen is that he might have actually had a mitochondrial disease. There are diseases that you can inherit if you have mutations in your mitochondrial genome. And his female relatives, the ones that shared mitochondria with him, tended to be ill, tended to die young, like his mother, who had died young. That seems to be the best guess, but nobody really knows what it was. Fortunately, he had money and he had a loving wife. When he thought about getting married, by the way, he actually drew up a list of the pros and cons. So he wrote the benefits would be children, constant companion, friend in one age who will feel interested in one, object to be beloved and played with, better than a dog anyhow. Home, charms of music, female chit-chat, these things good for one's health, but terrible loss of time. He did decide the pros outweigh the cons, and he got married in 1839. Nonetheless, he found time and energy to ponder the problem of where species came from. That tree-shaped diagram dates from one of his notebooks in 1837, the year after he got back. And he's beginning to try to come up with some sort of idea that would explain everything that he had seen. So I will go ahead and stop the recording now.